We affirm resolve the United States should expand universal background checks to all sales and transfers of ownership. Our sole contention is protecting the innocent. There are two impacts to gun violence in the United States. First is intimate partner violence, or IPV. Wendy Stockenberg of the Center for American Progress writes in 2013 that having a gun in the house increases the probability for homicide by an intimate partner by 20 times. She concludes the gap in the current law has led to an untold number of domestic violence perpetrators gaining easy access to guns through private sellers. Thankfully, the Center for American Progress quantifies in 2015 that states that require universal background checks for all gun sales had 46% fewer women that were shot and killed by their intimate partners. Second is by destroying inner city communities. David from the CNN writes in 2013 that in the present day, America does not blame itself, but instead a subset of the population for violence in inner cities. However, the widespread availability of guns is what causes confrontations that leave one person dead and the other in jail for life. If guns had not been so widely available, these individuals would not have become criminals in the first place. Instead, they're the actual victims of America's gun policies. Furthermore, the perpetual cycle of gun violence has devastating effects on inner cities. Fagan of the ASC writes, the ready availability of guns has shaped culture in which a confrontation turns deadly and is perceived as every situation is perceived as life or death. Carius of the University of Pennsylvania finds in 2008 that in these communities, guns are cheaper than textbooks, and 90% of black youth deaths comes as a result of gun violence. This is a long-term impact, as Reich of Princeton University writes, gun violence leads to negative psychological consequences such as anxiety, depression, increased dropouts, lower GPA, and 19% of children wishing they were dead. Furthermore, Jacob Schumann of the Huffington Post writes in 2015 that gun violence is what locks these communities into a cycle of poverty and creates inequality, not the other way around. Overall, Pew Research finds that gun violence kills 11,000 Americans each year, and of those, 6,000 are African Americans. This is more than the number of soldiers that died in Iraq and Afghanistan over 10 years. That's 110,000 Americans dying each year due to senseless gun violence. Thankfully, a universal background check would solve in a few ways. First is reducing availability. Jeffrey Fagan writes that the increased availability of guns increases the amount of youth violence. Decreasing the availability of guns would decrease violence overall. LaFollette of the University of Southern Florida indicates there's a strong relationship between overall gun availability and homicide rates. Second is increasing price. Guns in the status quo are cheaper than textbooks. However, restricting availability of guns would significantly increase prices, as LaFollette finds that whenever we decrease the availability of guns, prices increase as a result. And since most of these murders are being committed by teenagers, this would hinder their ability to buy them. Bandler furthers that UBC spike prices by up to $125. Overall, Douglas of New Mexico University finds that for every 1% increase in price, there's a 3% decrease in demand. Third is by cutting off the illicit market. Dixon of St. Louis University finds that because the illicit market relies on the legal market, decreasing the availability of legal guns decreases the supply for the illegal market. That's why Velosky of St. Croix quantifies that after controlling for multiple factors, states with universal background checks had 48% less illegal gun trafficking. Fourth is deterrence, as the NCPI finds that people who fail a background check are deterred and thus 30% less likely to commit crime down the road because they've had encounters with law enforcement. Currently in Chicago, Cole Morgan and the Trace writes in 2016, the majority of guns are coming in from neighboring states such as Indiana, which has incredibly weak gun laws. However, universal background checks would solve this by closing the loopholes. Remember, Velosky states that UBCs would decrease these trafficking by almost 50%. Overall, this is why McDonald finds that in the largest study ever conducted that reviewed over 130 studies over 60 years, more restrictions was associated with a decrease in homicides. Furthermore, according to Matero in 2013, when Missouri repealed UBCs, homicides increased by 25%. Finally, California and Boston University finds in 2016 that after studying all 50 states and isolating several different factors, that adopting universal background checks across the nation would decrease homicides by 65%.
Is everybody ready? James and I negate and contention one is NRA target practice. Universal background checks offer NRA members the opportunity to sharpen their shooting skills, leaving the policy full of holes. The BBC News reports that the NRA is one of the most powerful special interest lobbying groups, spending over $250 million per year. They also wield political influence through their members who vote based off of the NRA's candidate ratings. Adam Winkler of the UCLA explains that the NRA uses that influence to gut proposed gun control laws, leaving it with gaping holes. For example, the Brady Bill was originally meant to be the most comprehensive piece of gun legislation ever, but the NRA placed key loopholes, and as a result, it had no effect on crime or suicides. The NRA will do it again. Chelsea Parsons of the Center for American Progress reports that with the passage of universal background checks, the NRA would gut funding from agencies enforcing the checks and prevent those agencies from using databases to do their work. Contention 2 is gunning down reform. GM Filisko of the American Bar Association quantifies that 42 states have passed over 160 laws restricting gun use in response to the Sandy Hook shooting. Yamichi El-Sindor of USA Today finds that states with gun laws have a mortality rate 42% lower than states with fewer laws. However, passing universal background checks would lead to the destruction of these policies in courts. There are two methods courts use to determine the constitutionality of gun policy: strict and intermediate scrutiny. Strict scrutiny is the most restrictive standard used to protect fundamental freedoms like speech. It requires that laws be the least restrictive way to accomplish their goal, a near impossible standard to meet. Intermediate scrutiny is much less rigorous, only requiring that laws further a government interest. The OTB Journal of Law finds that the Supreme Court has declined nearly every Second Amendment case since 2010. Consequently, lower courts disagree on which standard to use. For example, while the Fourth Circuit opted for intermediate scrutiny, the Sixth Circuit has declared that guns belong under strict scrutiny. However, a universal background check would force the Supreme Court to become involved in the issue again. Andrea Lorenz of Reuters reports that the NRA sued the Brady gun control law in numerous federal courts until the Supreme Court struck down a key provision. When a universal background check reaches the Supreme Court, they will establish strict scrutiny as the standard. This is because the court is conservative and will rule as other conservative courts have. In fact, Adam Soliberto of the Seton Hall Law Review explains that Supreme Court precedent overwhelmingly supports strict scrutiny as the standard of review for the core protection of the Second Amendment. The impact is rolling back state gun policy. James Calavertinos of Penn State explains that almost all state gun policy would be found unconstitutional under strict scrutiny, which is why when the Sixth Circuit applied strict scrutiny, it used it to strike down an assault weapons ban and a magazine size restriction. Contention 3 is stopping the blue wave. Nate Silver of 538 projects that Democrats are on track to retake the House in 2018 thanks to Trump's unprecedented unpopularity. Passing background checks jeopardizes a Democratic victory. For Democrats, gun control is a political loser. Patrick Griffin, former chief congressional affairs lobbyist, argued that the assault weapons ban cost 40 Democratic seats in formerly safe districts. Since then, Salon magazine reports that ditching gun control has become conventional wisdom among centrist Democrats. However, passing universal background checks would bring this issue back into the spotlight. In order for Democrats to win in 2018, Jonathan Allen of Politico explains that Democrats need to win seats in almost exclusively Republican-leaning districts. This is a problem because The Atlantic reports that these districts are dominated by NRA members who punish Democrats for supporting gun control. If the Democrats lose, it signals the end of Obamacare. Obamacare is already on thin ice. CNN explains that the only reason Obamacare wasn't repealed was because a handful of Republicans crossed the aisle to save it. Most political pundits expected Obamacare to get axed. Relying on Republicans is not a sustainable strategy. The Democrats must win back Congress. If they don't, the consequences will be dire. David Himmelstein of the Washington Post writes that Trump Care would kill 43,000 people every year, more than all gun deaths combined. Thus, we negate.
Ready for talk? Yep. Alright, so let's talk about the Supreme Court. You tell me that when the Brady bill, or you tell me that the Brady bill went all the way up to the Supreme Court. So
Yeah.
if that's true, why did we not see them issue an intermediate or strict scrutiny decision on gun control?
Because it wasn't required at the time. They just struck down a provision of the Brady bill.
But I mean, the Brady bill still went to the Supreme Court, right? So
Yes.
why would that
Hold
not
on.
require a decision on strict or
Hold on.
intermediate?
Because there wasn't a circuit split on which standard of interpretation to use. But following the DC v. Heller decision, when the Supreme Court declared that guns were a fundamental right, it created a circuit split between intermediate scrutiny and strict scrutiny, which the Supreme Court is now forced to resolve the next time a piece of federal gun legislation makes it up there. But can I ask you a question? So, the states that currently have universal background checks, are those liberal states or conservative states?
On average, pretty liberal states. Yeah.
Do liberal states have an incentive to pass more gun control on top of universal background checks?
I mean, I would say yes, at the point where a lot of liberal commentators or liberal people would say there can still be more that's done, right?
Okay.
I would say universal background checks are effective. That doesn't mean that they're the only effective method, or that doesn't mean that there can't be other methods that we can use on top of them.
We'll talk about that later. Sure.
All right, so let's talk about this idea of NRA backlash, right?
Mhm.
So what's the uniqueness here at the point where they're already
Well, just a clarification thing, right? What our first contention is about is not NRA backlash. It's the NRA poking holes in universal background check policy to make sure that it won't be effective.
So is that an inherent problem with universal background checks, or is that a problem that's going to happen if it goes through this congressional process, if that makes sense, right? Or I guess to clarify, if we fiat that universal background checks get passed, why does this congressional
It's a problem on a
poking of
federal
loopholes?
level.
Wait, how so? Right?
Because the NRA has a lot of influence in Congress, but they don't have a lot of influence in liberal state legislatures like California and New York.
No,
Can I
that's
ask
not
you a
my question. That's not my question, right? I'm saying that if we fiat, implementation of universal background checks, why does it have to go through this process of the NRA, poking loopholes in it?
Because in terms of probability, if the resolution happens tomorrow, it's a lot more likely that the United States adopts a universal background check policy through it passing through Congress rather than every
Sure, but
single.
that's not what the resolution is
rather than
asking. It's
every
asking to
single
discuss,
state
the merits of
legislature,
this actual
all
legislation.
50 individually passing it.
That's not what I'm saying, though. I'm saying that, this resolution is not asking us about these, extraneous political consequences that the NRA is
I don't
gonna
think we
have.
look
It's
at
asking
public
the
forum
actual-
debate in a vacuum. I think we
Yeah,
look
obviously,
at it
but
in
I'm
terms
saying
of the
when we look at
probability
the
of the
legislation that's going
implementation
to
of
be
the
passed,
policy.
this resolution is asking about the merits of universal background checks, not the specific legislation that you're saying is the one that's going to be passed. We're the resolution is asking about in general, not this. Yeah, that's fine. Do you have a question?
Okay, so in terms of whether or not conservatives like gun control, do conservatives like gun control or do they not?
I mean, 70% of NRA members support UBC.
Wait, there's a problem with that statistic actually.
I mean,
That's based on data from about 15 years ago. The most updated NRA membership statistic says that only 4% support a universal background check.
Let's start off with our first contention where they talk about NRA-induced loopholes. This is just incredibly abusive to say that all of the pro's ground is going to be modified or undermined in a way that makes the pro functionally useless. Moreover, fiat, which means let the resolution be done, means that we pass universal background checks instantly, not debating it for months. This, if you give them their argument, that means that they could just circumvent any pro argument by saying there's going to be some sort of loophole in it. But also, if this was true, then we should see state-level universal background checks riddled with loopholes and defund and loopholes, which we don't actually see. But then, second of all, this loopholes argument is the reason why we're having this discussion in the debate space. We could debate for weeks on whether Congress will pass this bill or how they'll pass it or how it will be drafted, but that's what Congress does. That's not what you're supposed to do in a debate round. But then, second of all, realize that the NRA doesn't actually have that much influence in Congress. That's according to Think Progress, who finds that the idea of a fearsome and powerful NRA is a total myth. Their research concluded that the NRA has virtually no impact on the way that congressmen vote. At that point, they're not going to have that much influence in Congress. Make them show you that these loopholes wouldn't occur anyway. But now let's move on to their first argument, or their next argument, where they talk about strict scrutiny. The first argument against this is that it's at least worth a test. We'd still get some sort of offense if you affirm. Like Obamacare, everyone said it was going to fail in the Supreme Court, but it was still upheld by one vote. Even if policies look like they're going to fail, they can still be passed in the Supreme Court. But second of all, realize that they give you examples of when this is done, when this has happened before. Their own evidence talks about how the Supreme Court set a precedence in the Heller ruling that already exists. In previous examples, they haven't set a restrictive ruling. Make them show you what's specifically different about universal background checks. But then second of all, the Supreme Court has recently, in 2008, upheld the right to regulate firearms. That's because Weinberger found in 2015 that the Supreme Court concluded that Second Amendment rights are not unlimited with regard to who may possess firearms, what they may possess, or who may possess them, specifically ruling that Congress has authority under the Commerce Clause to regulate these firearms. At that point, make them show you why a universal background check is specifically going to be banned, or make them switch to the standard. But then next of all, they say that states are going to fix. The problem is that states aren't fixing, they're actually going in the wrong direction. That's a turn on their case because it means that we need to do something by affirming. Spires finds in 2017 that at the state level, Republicans have been advancing gun rights. Over the last decade, we've seen a proliferation of legislation that's been enacted to allow people to carry firearms in places that they've never been able to carry them before. But now let's move on to the third argument, where they talk about Democrats losing the midterms. First of all, background checks, you can actually turn this because background checks will mobilize Democrats because they're so popular around the nation. Frizzle of Times finds in 2016 that gun control will motivate the Democrats' base and not cost them in purple states. Polls show that the gun control push, universal background checks, is widely supported too. Nearly 90% of Americans support universal background checks according to multiple polls. At that point, that's a clear turn. It's going to mobilize the base because they'll see this policy and want more policies passed, or at least want to reward the party that does a good job passing it. But then next of all, realize that even if you don't buy that, the Democrats are going to win the midterms anyway for college voters. Wasserman finds in 2017 that the 2018 midterms feature the most college-educated electorate in history. Democrats' young base stayed home in the 2010 midterms, but 8 years later, there's a dynamic working the opposite way. Midterms always skew towards college-age voters. Whites with a college degree disapprove of Trump's performance 61%, concluding that if numbers like these hold through November 2018, college-educated voters will swing the midterms hard towards Democrats. Democrat that delinks them because it means that even if you pass gun control, like this electorate group is still going to show up and be mobilized. But then finally, they try and make this argument that people who care about gun rights are a lot more passionate than those who care about gun control. The problem is the Virginia elections prove that that isn't true. Nipperell finds in 2017 that during last week's Democratic sweep in Virginia, voters motivated by guns were evenly split between Democrat and Republican. That indicates that there's no voter gap. Both sides are going to turn out. Both sides will be mobilized. That delinks them from their impact of Republicans swinging the elections. For all those reasons, we have.
All right, I'm going to start by responding to their rebuttal, and after I finish doing that, I'm going to go down their case. Is everyone ready? Start on their responses to NRA target practice. They say it's abusive to say the bill would be modified or unfair. Actually, it's abusive to say it's going to be perfect, because every single historical example of a background check or gun policy at the federal level has been modified and amended by the NRA to be almost completely useless. Even if it's not that bad, we can still guarantee you the NRA is going to have some sort of influence in the workings of the bill because their influence is so great. Second of all, they say that state policies are going to have loopholes too. That's not true. The NRA does not have a stronghold in liberal states like New York, California, Massachusetts, etc. At the federal level, though, they do command a strong presence, meaning that there will be loopholes there. That's a unique problem with federal policy, a reason we outweigh. Then, finally, they say the NRA has no impact. NRA grade ratings literally command the effect of elections. People don't vote for people who have lower grades. Obviously, the NRA has a lot of political clout and influence. Their members are very loyal and single-issue voters. With that in mind, let's go to contention 2 on strict scrutiny. So, first of all, he says that even if it looks like it's going to be unconstitutional, it can still pass. That's not our argument. We are not saying universal background checks are unconstitutional. We are saying even if they are ruled constitutional, the strict scrutiny standard will be applied because the justices believe that gun rights are a fundamental freedom and that will decimate all other policies at the state level. That is our argument. Then, he says, in Heller we didn't see this restriction occur. That's because in Heller there was not the split at the circuit courts. We tell you that it only occurred in the past 2 years where courts of the lower circuits have been ruling on differing standards. Now the Supreme Court needs to resolve them, and the universal background check lawsuit gives them the chance to do so. That's why they will rule now. Then, they said that in the Heller decision, they said that Second Amendment rights are not unlimited. And we agree, that's true. A strict scrutiny case does not mean that all Second Amendment rights are going to be completely decimated. Completely unlimited. However, it does mean that most laws are not going to pass the standard, which Penn State tells you is almost the vast majority of state laws, meaning that we are still gaining access into our link. Then finally, they say the states in the status quo are moving in the wrong direction. 2 responses here. First of all, we tell you, in 42 states, we have passed 117 policies, reducing gun violence by 42%. That is progress. But second of all, even if states are not making good progress, some progress is better than no progress, which is what their world looks like. At that level, we are looking into a decrease in state policy because strict screening will be used to destroy all state policy, and state policy outweighs federal policy for 3 reasons. First of all, is the holes in our first contention. The NRA doesn't have influence at the state level. Second of all, because state policies work better. They are stricter, for example, gun magazine bans, bump stock bans. And third of all, every piece of defense that we put on our case, on their case, is going to be a reason to vote for state policy. Because like Brian tells you in the crossfire, essentially what's going on is there are some states with universal background checks, but other policies too. What if we prove that universal background checks are not the factor decreasing violence, then it's the other state policies that are actually working, and therefore it's our offense that's winning and decreasing violence. Let's go to their case. Let's start first of all on domestic violence. And you look to the fact that the New York Times finds that the signs for domestic violence are relatively hard to predict, which means that in general these are like felonies like community service, which don't actually show up on a background check, meaning that domestic violence will go untouched. Second, on their inner-city community argument on gun crime, we're going to be reading you 2 reasons why criminals still get guns. First of all is bad apple dealers, because right now in the status quo, 1% of dealers are supplying 60% of guns to criminals. That's because, like we told you in our first convention, the ATF has literally no money, they can't regulate these dealers, and none of them end up getting prosecuted. As a result, criminals can still get access to guns through these dealers. And second of all is the straw purchase, because the Hill tells you that criminals can simply have other people buy guns for them, which represents around 30% of gun sales. These people can still pass a background check for them. With that in mind, this has 2 implications. First of all, is Bogart tells you that if national policy fails or is perceived to be not working, it's going to further the NRA's narrative that these gun background checks and universal background checks don't work, which means we're going to be seeing less gun control in the long term. And second of all, we tell you that if universal background checks are another factor decreasing violence at the state level, it is the policies that we discuss in our case. So, let's go to their other arguments here. On their impact. The second one on an increase in price. We tell you that this doesn't matter because the MIS Institute finds that for criminals, gun demand is inelastic because they have to buy a gun because it's part of their lifestyle, it's what they use to make money. However, for good civilians, it is elastic, which is only a bad thing because the good guys don't get guns, but the bad guys still do. And fourth of all, on their third and fourth warrant about deterrence and illegal trafficking. The Guardian tells you that red states are not going to enforce background checks in either world. For example, when Colorado passed background checks, they didn't enforce any of them, meaning that smuggling is still going to be an issue in their world, which can still solve for the rest of the impacts and still decrease gun violence in other ways. So that's what urge you to vote neg.
Everyone ready?
Who's the judge? Thank you.
Let's talk about the Colorado example.
Yeah.
Are you saying that Colorado passed background checks and they just refused to enforce them?
That's what happened, yeah.
So like they passed them, and then the same people that passed them are like, we're not going to enforce them.
The local police officers said they would.
Okay, sure. You have a question?
Okay, sure. So my question is that if we prove to you that universal background checks aren't actually decreasing crime, then isn't the other policies that the states have, like assault weapons bans, bump stop bans, actually the factor reducing crime?
Like, first of all, we would say that a lot of those policies are either getting rolled back or moving in the wrong direction.
Well,
but then even
let's
beyond that,
theoretically
you
think
haven't
about
even
this.
given us a chance to respond to that.
Well, I'm saying theoretically, if we win the argument that universal background checks are not the factor decreasing violence, is it these other policies that are doing it?
Yeah, like if you show, wait, no, right? Like our studies specifically isolate universal
No, I'm
background.
saying if we win the argument, right, hypothetically.
Like, let's talk about this once you've done that.
You
Can I have a question? Yeah,
Sure.
So every Supreme Court case has to have some sort of standing or issue that brings it to the Supreme Court, right?
Yep.
So what is a standing in this Alberta case? Like the evidence, what is it talking about?
What do you mean the standing? The
Like-
Alberta case
like
is
who-
analyzing the Heller decision. And
No,
this is in the Heller decision, the Supreme Court said that gun rights are a fundamental freedom, which means they believe that they belong under strict scrutiny. But they didn't end up making that ruling because the circuit courts were not divided on the issue. But now they are. So if the issue comes up again, they will make that ruling.
But did the courts rule on did the courts rule on universal background checks or something different?
They haven't ruled on universal background checks before, no. But the argument has nothing to do with universal background checks. We are saying the idea of federal policy being sued by the NRA inherently means the court's going to use it to implement strict scrutiny as the standard for all gun laws, and at the state level, that's going to lead to the repeal
Wait,
of
why
lots and
do
lots of
they
gun
have to
laws.
issue a comprehensive ruling, right?
With the Supreme Court, any ruling they issue is stare decisis. It's comprehensive, the law of the land.
Like, okay, but they've issued rulings in the past that apply to like one specific issue without setting precedent for the whole country.
Like what?
I can't think of one off the top of my head.
Supreme Court
but-
precedents
like
are
Heller.
the law of the land.
Heller, sure.
Yeah, Heller was the law of the land.
Okay, do you have a question?
You can ask him.
All right, so let's talk about your straw purchases, right?
Yeah.
Okay, like why are straw purchases high under universal background?
Because somebody can just go to someone that could pass a background check and then have them buy the gun for them. So they
Okay,
can still get a gun.
but what about the accountability created by universal background?
What do you mean the accountability?
Like
There
if you
is
can
no
now
accountability.
know who buys the gun.
You know who buys the gun in either world. The problem is that these people, you don't know how they end up getting the gun. Like they can still have a straw purchase and just still get the gun. Okay, so my question for you would be, you talk about this idea of smuggling. So if red states don't want to enforce gun laws in either world, won't there be smuggling in either world?
Okay, the problem is, like the Colorado example isn't exactly analogous to federal policy
Well,
because the government. Can I please finish? Because the government has ways of forcing states to change laws. Like with the national drinking age, they force states to raise it to 21 by taking away their highway funding and
We
university.
tried to do that with EPA regulations. That didn't really work out.
Overall. We have 7 seconds.
Okay, everyone ready?
Yeah.
Okay, it's gonna be the neg and then the after. So start off the idea of NRA loopholes. They tell you it's abusive to say like this law is going to be perfect. That's not what we're saying. We'll concede that universal background checks just in general are perfect. We're debating whether it's good or bad. What is abusive is to say that this general law of universal background checks might be good, but then the specific legislation the NRA passes where they poke loopholes is bad. That's abusive because it's good, like we're debating the general idea, not the specific piece of legislation. But second, where you say we fiat, which means we don't have to go through this like congressional process where the NRA pokes loopholes. But then second, go on to getting gun reform. Realize their evidence one says that this is a result of Maryland passing a
semi automatic ban. At that point, it's not unique. But then second, you're going to realize that the state split, they never explained to you why the state split didn't exist before DC versus Heller. States already had gun laws before these cases, and yet the Supreme Court still did not make any ruling about stricter intermediate scrutiny. That proves there's no probability the Supreme Court actually making a ruling on this issue. But then go to the blue wave, remember the term we give you, we're mobilizing Democrats. That's going to be an independent reason to vote for us right here. Because they themselves do that Obamacare is like a huge issue that results in like thousands of lives. It's where we're mobilizing Democrats, preventing Republicans from gaining majority and taking a Democratic majority. That's going to prevent any Obamacare repeal in the future. But then go on to our case. First, on this idea of urban violence, they tell you a few things. One, they tell you this is bad purchasing. Number one, if it's 1% of dealers, that makes it really easy to enforce. That means we just have to shut down that 1%, and we have a huge amount of solvency. But then second, realize that it's easy. But then second, you're going to realize that or actually go into this street purchase. One, the Center for American Progress tells you that whenever you implement universal background checks, it makes it much easier to go against straw purchasers because you actually have a law where you say whenever you have a straw purchase and give it to somebody else, that's now illegal because they didn't go through a background check. That's why we went to British funds a six times reduction in the amount of straw purchasing. That's going to be another word for us. But then go on to the idea where they tell you that criminals are going to get their guns no matter what. Realize what the from evidence tells you is that it's not about criminals getting guns for the sole purpose of using crime. It's the culture where somebody has a gun and they don't mean to use it for a crime, but a confrontation arises and they use it to shoot somebody, and that leads to 1% dead and the other person in jail. That's what leads to the gun culture. But then that's going to go to that's going to go to the left line evidence, which shows you 1% increase in price leads to a 3% decrease in demand. That's where you link it to homicide.
Okay. We're going to start running our prep.
Okay. Their case, our third contention, and then I'll just sign those from there. Everybody ready? On their case on bad apple dealers, we tell you that 1% of dealers give 60% of guns to criminals, and that's the way that criminals are getting their guns right now. They just tell you, oh, it's going to be easy to solve. But we tell you, if it was easy to solve, it would have already been solved. The reason it's not easy to solve is because the ATF has been defunded, which means that the ATF is never going to be able to enforce it, and criminals are going to get guns either way. That is terminal defense on their case. But with that, go to our third contention. They extend this turn about mobilizing Democrats. But that is based on the success of other gun policy, which means that our case is the prerequisite because if a UBC fails or if state gun policy fails, that means that the Democrats are going to lose the 2018 election. With that, go to our first contention. This first contention functions as terminal defense on their case because we tell you that from the Parsons evidence that the NRA is going to defund the ATF, leading to the idea that the UBC is never going to be successfully enforced. They just tell you, oh, it's abusive, that we can say that the general idea of we're not debating the general idea of a universal background check. We tell you that every single federal universal background check proposal has included a section where the NRA puts holes in it, so it's not abusive. It's the most probable implementation. But that functions as a turn on their case also because the Bogart evidence that James reads in his rebuttal, which goes cold unresponded to, tells you that when national policy fails, that feeds the NRA's narrative and leads to the failure of future policy and the rollback of state policy, which is the most successful thing in the round. But with that, go to our second contention. By this point in the round, we are only getting one response where they tell you, why didn't a circuit split exist before? We tell you that Heller caused the circuit split because no standard was declared, and now that there is a circuit split, the next time that a federal gun policy, a UBC, goes up to the Supreme Court is going to need to make a choice. We tell you they're going to choose strict scrutiny because Soliverdo tells you that the previous court precedent indicates they're going to choose strict scrutiny. Calavertinos from Penn State tells you that that's going to lead to the rollback of state policy, which is really important for the three pieces of weighing that James gives you in the rebuttal, which also doesn't go responded to. We tell you that state policy doesn't have holes like federal policy does. And second, it's stricter and more tailored to the state problems. And third, because if a universal background check fails, like we tell you it does, that means that the state policy is the real thing that is decreasing the number of people being killed in these states that have a universal background check. We tell you that state policy is the cleanest link to lives in the round, and that is why we tell you to negate. Sorry.
Okay. So y'all have first question.
Yeah, sure. So let's talk about the terminal defense you put on our case, where you say we're not going to be able to solve because the ATF budget.
Yeah.
So is the internal link into this lack of enforcement of the NRA loophole?
No, it's not future NRA loopholes. It's existing funding of the ATF that's already been destroyed. And you guys say it's going to be really easy to solve, but only 0.1% of gun shops that violate the ATF's laws ever end up in a court. Most just are able to completely avoid prosecution.
Okay, wait. So what are these laws that they're trying to I guess, catch these criminals on, right? Like,
So, yeah, it's like-
what is the reason for like why it's so hard to prosecute?
Right, so
Besides-
thousands of these stores are selling directly to criminals without any background checks, and they say, oh, our guns were stolen, we weren't actually doing that. The ATF knows that this is probably going on, but they only have the resources to check gun shops once every 5 years, and even that only happens 42% of the time, because they just have completely no funds and only 5,000 employees. So as a result, all these bad apple gun stores are free to do as they wish, and nothing gets punished.
Right, sure, do you have a question?
Y'all can ask him.
Right, yeah, sure. So like, let's talk about this idea of like, I guess, like gunning down reform, like state laws, right?
Yeah.
So would you agree that states like Texas and Oklahoma are like just like really hard red states in general are just inherently never going to pass gun control?
Yes.
We agree.
So,
There
like,
are-
at that
However-
point, like, what solvency do you have like in a federal level? Doesn't that inherently
So the
make
reason that it doesn't matter that we don't have solvency in those states is because you also don't have solvency in those states. Because what James
I'm
tells
just
you in
saying,
the
like in
rebuttal.
general on weighing, don't you have like an inherently minimized scope?
Wait,
No,
here's why I'm
because
telling you that
ultimately
your
red
scope
states
is the
don't
exact
enforce
same.
universal background checks. That's
Yeah.
the first response. The second response is that we already see reform going on in 42 states. Even if we can't get 8 states to jump on board, we say don't
Wait,
risk
but how,
losing.
how like
Can I-
strong is this reform in these groups?
It's pretty good, but let me quickly finish. We tell you, don't risk the reform that's going on in 42 states, don't have all those laws struck down just because you want reform in 8 more states. That's inherently a bad trade-off.
Okay, yeah, so let's talk about like just basically say these 42 states pass some sort of gun control law.
Yeah.
How like effective has the gun control law be like states like
So,
Oklahoma?
yeah, so well, first of all, like ever since these policies have been passed on a state level, gun crime has decreased 42%.
In those
but
states.
also in
But
those
is that,
states.
like-
But also, what I said at the end of my summary is also true here, where I'm saying that if a universal background check doesn't work, that means that the statistics that you read about a UBC in those states decreasing gun crime is actually caused by state policy
Like
because the
assault
UBC
weapons
is
bans,
not the thing
bump
that's doing
stock
it.
bans.
That's kind of like what you're
Well, no, this is
Yeah.
what I asked your partner in Second Crossfire too, right? Like, if in a state with a universal background check and 5 other gun policies, a universal background check has holes like the bad apple dealers, we tell you the 42% reduction in violence comes from the other state policies we say go away under strict scrutiny.
It's also the concession that I get in the first crossfire when it says that there's more liberal like policies being passed on top of the UBC.
That's basically time.
Starting with the con case, saying defense, and doing weighing, elements. Everybody ready? Alright, let's start off with our first contention. Really today, they're going to be loopholes. 2 really crucial responses. First, the reason we're having this debate is to look at the merits of universal background checks, not necessarily the merits of the way Congress will graft them. But second of all, they dropped the think progress evidence that says NRA really doesn't have that much influence in Congress. Now let's move on to their contention, really talk about strict scrutiny. First of all, they dropped the Spires analysis, which shows you that states are currently going in the wrong direction. That's really important because it means the affirmative is the only one that's taking a step forward. They're constantly going backwards right now. But then second of all, they don't give you the probability of it. It's not. Remember the Obamacare example. Everyone said that was going to fail. It won't necessarily fail. So we at least have some sort of risk of offense on the affirmative. But then second of all, realize that on time frame analysis, you can weigh this because they say any federal gun law will trigger their policy. That means that if any law is passed ever, that links into their policy, which means it's not unique. Now let's go into the third argument. This is a sole place where you can vote for us. That's because of this frizzle turn that we give you in rebuttal. This says that universal background checks specifically mobilize a large portion of the Democrats' base. That's really important because their own Hizzle seat evidence says that repealing Obamacare would cost 40,000 lives. Even if we just slightly increase the chance of keeping Obamacare in place, that's still 4 times the number of homicides by gun every year. That's the biggest impact in today's round. You vote right there. But now based off of our case, the first thing that you can extend is, their first argument is talking about bad apple dealers, how 1% produce 60% of guns. The problem here is that 1, this is only mitigatory defense, but 2, the fact that it's 1% means it's at least easier to target. Even if we only solve 1.1%, we're still making progress forward. That's why this Center for American Progress evidence says that we have a 6 times reduction in the amount of straw purchases. At that point, you look to the From analysis, which gives you the weighing through today's round. This isn't about criminals committing crime, it's about the prevalence of guns in America that's creating criminals out of inner city youth. That's why we tell you that a 1% increase in the price of guns lead to a 3% decrease in the amount of people that purchase them, overall reducing the availability of guns. When guns aren't around, that means that the lethality of confrontations goes down significantly. That helps preserve the inner city youth and decreases homicides overall. That's why you should affirm.
We're going to run the remainder of our trial.
So the order is going to be our third contention, their case, and then back to our second contention. Everyone ready? On our third contention, they say as long as there's any chance the Dems lose, that's bad. First of all, no, this is like a very hypothetical argument. And second of all, we tell you the Dems losing is based on gun violence going up or down, which is the rest of our debate. Our second contention, their first contention, which means it's irrelevant. Let's go on to their case. So, basically, we're going to be extending two responses here. First of all, as our NRA target practice convention, they say the NRA doesn't have a lot of influence. We tell you in every other historical bill they were able to gut it and amend it. Logically, they're going to be able to do it again. It's going to be severely watered down. Even if you don't buy that, the best response at the end of the round is the fact that bad apple dealers are going to be selling to people. They say if the price increases, it's no good. But bad apple dealers are federally licensed dealers that can sell at the same price, not the black market. And we tell you, insofar as 1% of dealers sell 60% of guns, and almost none of these dealers get prosecuted, only 0.1%, only more criminals are simply going to turn to this dealership, which means we're going to be seeing no reduction in violence in the long term. But these two dealings in their case are a reason to vote for us. That's because the Bograd evidence that goes cold drop the entire round tells you that failed gun policy at the federal level is used as an example to enshrine gun culture at the state level and has led to the repeals of state level policies in the past. That one turn is enough to win us the round. But even if you don't buy that, let's go to strict scrutiny. So, first of all, he says a new response and final focus that we're going to be seeing federal policy eventually. Two front lines here. First of all, the court is conservative now. We don't know if it's going to be conservative in 17 years when a new federal policy is passed. We haven't seen a federal policy in 17 years. When's the next one going to be? But second of all, the circuit split is recent news. It's in the past 2 years. In the 17, 20 years, we don't know that the circuit split is going to be big headline news. We tell you that's not going to matter in the long-term things. So, 3 links here. First of all, we tell you the NRA is going to sue, like they did with the Brady bill, that once it ends up in court, the court will rule with strict scrutiny, something that Cold conceded at the end of the round. And third of all, strict scrutiny leads to the decimation of all state-level policies. That's because Penn State University finds that almost no state-level policy will be found constitutional under a strict scrutiny policy. They say that no progress is happening in the states. That's not true. 42 states have passed 117 laws reducing gun violence by 42%. That ultimately is progress. So we say, if they say there's going to be some states we can't touch, we say don't risk reform in 8 more states and jeopardize reform in the 42 states that already have it. We say vote neg and save those states. That's what we should engage.